The advertisement had been Wesley Ramsey's idea, and he had written every word of it with the cold precision of a man ordering livestock, which was, his housekeeper Mrs. Dodd had told him sharply before she quit, exactly the problem. He had posted it in 3 newspapers across Kansas and Missouri in the spring of 1878, and it read as follows: Rancher, 31, owner of 600 acres outside Caldwell, Kansas, seeks a sensible and practical woman for marriage. Must be capable of managing a household, keeping accounts, enduring hardship without complaint, and possessing sufficient good judgment to be trusted in matters of consequence. Romantic temperament unnecessary. Respond in writing to Wesley Ramsey, Ramsey Ranch, Caldwell, Sumner County, Kansas. He had received 11 responses. He had read all of them once and discarded 9 of them for what he privately categorized as excessive sentimentality, by which he meant they had used the word hopeful or described sunsets in a favorable light. He had nearly discarded the 10th for beginning with a small hand-drawn sparrow in the upper corner of the page which he considered frivolous, but then his eye had caught the 2nd paragraph, and he had read it through twice, and then a 3rd time, and then he had folded the letter and put it in the inner pocket of his coat for reasons he did not examine very carefully. The letter was from Susan Bishop of Independence, Missouri, aged 26. She wrote with a directness that was almost startling. She told him plainly that she had worked as a bookkeeper for her uncle's dry goods store for 4 years, that she was competent with a rifle, having grown up on the edge of settled land where such a skill was not optional, that she had nursed her mother through 2 winters of illness before her mother died the previous November, and that she had no particular illusions about marriage being a romantic arrangement. She had needs, a home, stability, purpose, and she understood he had needs of a practical domestic nature, and she saw no reason why 2 sensible adults could not reach a satisfactory arrangement. She did not describe sunsets. She did not use the word hopeful. She did, however, add a single line at the bottom of the letter below her name that he kept returning to without quite meaning to. It said, "I expect honesty from any man I agree to bind my life to, and I will offer the same in return without exception." He had written back within the week. The stage that arrived in Caldwell on a warm Thursday in late April of 1878 was 2 hours behind schedule because a wheel had cracked somewhere past Wichita, and the passengers had been obliged to wait in the heat, while the driver made repairs with what limited tools he had on hand. Susan Bishop had used those 2 hours to fix the repair herself, having noticed from the window that the driver was making a fundamental error in the way he was seating the replacement wheel, and she had climbed down from the stage in her traveling dress and corrected him in a tone that left no room for argument. She arrived in Caldwell with dust on her hem, her dark hair slightly loosened from its pins by the wind, and a small leather case of tools in her left hand that she had made no attempt to hide or explain. She was not what anyone would call conventionally beautiful, but she had a quality that was harder to name, a steadiness in her brown eyes, a particular way of standing that suggested she had evaluated her surroundings and found them manageable. She was tall for a woman, and she carried herself as though she had decided long ago not to apologize for it. Wesley was waiting at the stage stop. He had told himself he was not nervous, which was why he had arrived 40 minutes early and rearranged the position of his hat 4 times during the wait. He was a lean, sun-weathered man with dark eyes that tended toward a serious expression, not because he was humorless but because humor, in his experience, was something that had to be earned in a conversation rather than offered up front. He had good hands, strong and careful, and a jaw that the women in town had privately described as unfair, not that he knew this. He watched Susan Bishop climb down from the stage with her leather tool case and her dusty hem, and he felt something shift in the region of his chest that he immediately attributed to the coffee. He had drunk too quickly at breakfast. She looked at him across the street, and he could tell the precise moment she decided he was who she was looking for, because her chin lifted slightly and she walked toward him with the directness of someone who had already made up her mind about what she was going to say. "Mr. Ramsey," she said, stopping in front of him. She extended her hand as if she were meeting a business associate. He shook it. Her grip was firm. "Miss Bishop." There was a brief silence in which they looked at each other with the particular honesty of two people who are both doing an evaluation and both know it. "You're not what I pictured," he said. "Neither are you," she said. "I pictured someone older." "I'm 31. I know what your advertisement said. I just pictured someone who looked it." He did not quite know what to do with that, so he reached for her travel bag, which was sitting on the ground beside her. She had one large trunk being unloaded from the stage, and beside it the leather tool case. He reached for the trunk. "I have a wagon," he said. "Good," she said, and picked up the tool case herself before he could reach for it. They drove out of town on the Caldwell Road in the late afternoon light, and the Kansas prairie opened up around them like a long exhale, golden grass, wide sky, the smell of something clean moving on the wind. Susan looked out at it with an expression he could not read, and he found himself watching her from the corner of his eye with an attention he did not examine too carefully. "It's flat," she said. "Yes. I like it," she said. "I always feel like I can see trouble coming from a flat country." He thought about that. "I suppose that's one way to look at it. What other way is there? Some people find it lonely." She considered this with the same serious attention she seemed to give everything. "Loneliness is an interior condition," she said. "It doesn't have much to do with the view." He did not respond to this, but he thought about it for the remaining 40 minutes of the drive, which was longer than he had thought about most things recently. The ranch house was a solid, practical structure, 2 stories, well-built, functional, with none of the ornamental details that the newer houses in Caldwell were beginning to acquire. It needed paint on the south wall, and the kitchen garden was overgrown, and there was a fence post by the front gate that had been listing at an angle for 3 weeks because he had not found the time to reset it. He watched Susan's eyes move over these things as they pulled up, and he braced himself for something, though he was not sure what. She said nothing about any of it. She climbed down from the wagon, looked at the house for a long moment, and then said, "How many people on the payroll?" 6 ranch hands. No domestic help since Mrs. Dodd left." "When did she leave?" "February." "And you've been managing the household alone since February?" "I've been managing," he said, which was technically true if one defined managing loosely. She walked to the front gate, put both hands on the listing fence post, tested its resistance, and nodded to herself as if confirming a diagnosis. Then she went inside. He stood beside the wagon for a moment, looking at the post, and then slowly followed her. What he had expected from a sensible and practical woman was someone who would run his household efficiently, keep the books he had no patience for, and be a quiet and competent presence at his table and in his life. He had not expected someone who would be in his kitchen by 6 the following morning, with the account ledgers spread across the table, and a list of discrepancies already noted in a clear, firm hand. He had not expected her to spend that first afternoon walking the property with the measuring stride of someone who already owned it, asking questions about the cattle count and the water rights and the terms of the lease he had on the eastern pasture, all of which she followed with a silence that meant she was thinking rather than the silence that meant she had run out of things to say. He had not expected to find himself, on the 3rd evening, sitting across the supper table from her, and talking, actually talking, the kind of conversation that moves from one subject to another with the ease of something that has no destination and doesn't need one. They talked about the water rights dispute his neighbor Hector Grady had been agitating about for 2 years. They talked about the price of cattle at the Caldwell stockyards. They talked, somehow, about Independence, Missouri, and what it had been like to grow up on the edge of the frontier in the years just after the war, and she told him something about her father with a brevity that made it clear the subject was still tender. He had died when she was 16, and she had learned the accounts from her uncle afterward because there had been no one else. "You stepped in," he said. "Someone had to," she said, without any particular quality of heroism in her voice, as though it were simply a fact of the way things were. He looked at her across the table in the lamplight, and the shift in his chest was back, and this time he could not attribute it to coffee. The practical difficulties of the ranch, and the question of whether the two of them were going to proceed toward marriage, had not yet been formally resolved, because Wesley had said in his letter that he would like a period of, he had called it acquaintance, which Susan had understood to mean trial, which she had accepted because she found the honesty of it preferable to pretense. They were living in the same house, which the people in Caldwell already had opinions about, but Susan had addressed this directly by informing Mrs. Cole at the general store on her second visit to town that she and Mr. Ramsey had a clear arrangement, and that she did not require the town's approval of it, which had caused Mrs. Cole to blink twice rapidly, and then apparently decide she respected Susan Bishop. The first real difficulty came in the second week, when Hector Grady rode onto the property. Grady was a large man who operated the spread to the northeast, and he had a particular quality of displeasure that he wore like a coat, the kind of man who experienced other people's competence as a personal affront. He had been disputing the water rights on the creek that ran along the eastern boundary of Wesley's property for nearly 2 years, insisting that his cattle had prior claim to the lower stretch, and that Wesley had been unjustly diverting the flow. Wesley was out near the southern pasture when Grady arrived, and Susan was in the yard attending to the fence post she had quietly reset on her own on the second morning, adding a second crossbar that she had determined from examination would give it considerably more stability. She was still holding the hammer when Grady rode up. "Where's Ramsey?" he said, without dismounting, and with the particular tone of a man who was not accustomed to finding women standing in yards with hammers. "Working the south pasture," Susan said. She set the hammer against the post. "Can I help you?" Grady looked at her with an expression that moved from dismissal to appraisal to something unpleasant that she recognized and did not particularly concern herself with. "Who are you?" "Susan Bishop. I'm managing the household accounts and assisting with the property." He made a short sound that was not quite a laugh. "Ramsey hired a woman to do accounts." "Mr. Ramsey did not hire me," she said calmly. "We are in a period of acquaintance toward marriage, and the accounts needed managing." "Now, did you have business with Mr. Ramsey, or was there something specific I could address?" Grady's eyes narrowed. "The creek water. He's been diverting at the bend again." "I know about the creek," Susan said. "I've read the land survey from 1873 and the county records on the water rights allocation. You have a legal claim to the lower stretch from the second bend to the property line. Mr. Ramsey has a legal claim to everything above the second bend. If he's been diverting above the second bend, he is within his rights. If the diversion you're referring to is happening below the second bend, I would like to know the specific date and circumstance, because the survey map I have does not support that interpretation." Grady stared at her. It was the particular stare of a man who had expected to be agreed with or argued with using volume and had encountered neither. "I'll speak to Ramsey," he said finally. "Of course," she said. "I'll let him know you came by." He rode off and Susan went back to the fence post. Wesley came in for the midday meal and she told him what had happened in the same matter-of-fact way she told him about the account discrepancy she had found in the feed bills, and he sat down at the table and looked at her for a long moment. "You read the land survey," he said. "I found it in the box with the deed and the cattle records. It seemed relevant. I've been disputing with Grady for 2 years." "I know. You've been disputing on the wrong grounds. The actual issue is the placement of the boundary marker at the second bend, which was moved at some point. You can see from the survey that the original marker was 6 feet further north. If you have the marker restored to its original position, the diversion you're using is clearly above the second bend and clearly within your rights. The county clerk in Wichita would have the original survey on record." He was quiet for a moment. That's a 2-year problem. That could be resolved in a week, she said. If you want, I'll write the letter to the county clerk today. He looked at her across the table, and there was something in his expression that she noticed, not surprise exactly, but something wider than the careful control he usually maintained. Something that looked, briefly, like he had been caught off guard in a way he found unexpectedly pleasant. "Write the letter," he said. She wrote it that afternoon, and the reply came back within 10 days confirming what she had found, and the county sent a surveyor to restore the original marker, and the water rights dispute that had cost Wesley 2 years of aggravation and 3 letters to a lawyer in Wichita was resolved before the end of May without Wesley having to raise his voice or his lawyer's bill. He told her it was good work. She told him it was straightforward once you had the right documents. He said that was the point, that she had known which documents to look for. She looked at him for a moment and then looked back at her ledger, and he stood in the kitchen doorway a beat longer than was necessary before going back out to the horses. The month of May moved through them like a current. There were long evenings on the porch after the hands had gone to their bunkhouse, when the Kansas sky turned colors that neither of them particularly remarked on, but both of them noticed. Susan began learning the rhythms of the cattle operation with the same systematic attention she brought to everything. She could not ride as well as Wesley's hands, and she said so plainly. But by the 3rd week, she had improved enough on the bay mare that Charlie Voss, the senior hand who had worked the Ramsey spread for 4 years and viewed all change with suspicion, told Wesley quietly that she had a good eye for it. Charlie Voss telling Wesley this mattered, because Charlie Voss's approval was not distributed casually. There was the evening it rained, the first real storm of the season, and the roof over the east room developed a leak that Susan discovered by finding 3 inches of water on the floor. She had already moved the furniture and positioned every available pot and basin before Wesley came up the stairs to investigate the sound of rain inside the house. He stood in the doorway looking at the arrangement she had made, which was both efficient and oddly creative. She had rigged a kind of gutter from a piece of tin she had found in the yard to direct the main stream directly into the largest basin rather than losing it across the floor, and he made a sound that took him a moment to recognize as laughter. It was genuine laughter, the unguarded kind, and it surprised him, and he saw it surprise her too. She looked up from where she was adjusting the tin gutter and found him laughing in the doorway, and for a moment she looked as though she was going to say something sharp and practical, and then something in her face softened and she laughed too, briefly, a real laugh that changed the quality of the room entirely. "I'll get the tar and the ladder in the morning," he said. "I'll help," she said. "You don't have to, I've patched roofs before," she said. "My mother's house had a worse leak than this. I know what I'm doing." He believed her without reservation, which he recognized as a new thing. They patched the roof together the following morning, both of them up on the slope in the clean post-storm air, and it was harder work than he expected to concentrate on what he was doing with her working 3 feet away. Her sleeves rolled to the elbow, her hair pulled back, talking about the pitch of the roof and the material properties of the tar in a completely matter-of-fact way that he found, against all logic, more distracting than if she had been doing something deliberately charming. This was the problem he had not accounted for. He had asked for a sensible and practical woman, and she was sensible, and she was practical, and both of these things were exactly what he had said he needed, and he had gotten them. What he had not accounted for was that she would also be, in the evenings when she read by the fire, completely absorbed and quietly present in a way that made the house feel inhabited for the first time in years. He had not accounted for the way she argued with him, directly, without performance, as though she expected him to be capable of handling a real disagreement and would be disappointed if he proved otherwise. He had not accounted for the fact that she had, apparently, strong opinions about the quality of Kansas coffee, and had taken the matter of the coffee beans into her own hands after her 3rd morning on the ranch, resulting in a coffee that was objectively better than anything he had produced in 3 years. He had not accounted, fundamentally, for the way he looked forward to the evenings. He was a man who had not looked forward to evenings for a long time. Since his father had died and left him the ranch at 24, and since the woman he had expected to marry had looked at the ranch and the work and the isolation and chosen instead a banker in Topeka. Since those things, the evenings had been something to endure rather than something to anticipate. Now there was Susan Bishop reading by the fire, or going over the ledgers with that particular concentration that made a small line appear between her eyebrows, or occasionally looking up and saying something that required him to actually think before he responded, and the evenings had a quality they had lacked. He did not say any of this to her. He was not sure he had the words for it, or that words were the right vehicle. He was not a man who had much practice with the interior observation of his own condition. What he had was a Tuesday in June. It was one of those days that began badly and accelerated. A section of fence in the north pasture came down in the night, and 12 head of cattle had gone through it and wandered into the rough country near the creek. They spent the morning recovering the cattle, which involved considerably more effort than it should have because 2 of the younger hands were arguing with each other over something that had happened the previous evening, and were performing their work with the focused incompetence of men whose attention is elsewhere. Wesley separated them with the kind of quiet authority that Charlie Voss had always admired in him, and then rode the fence line for another 2 hours to identify the full extent of the damage. When he got back to the house at midday, there was a situation. A woman named Nell Prout had come to the ranch on foot from town about 4 miles, in the heat, because her husband Tom Prout, who worked at the stockyards, had not come home the previous night, and Nell had heard from someone that Tom had been seen riding north on the Caldwell Road, and she was frightened and did not know where else to go. She was 23 and had 2 young children with her, and she had been crying enough that her face was swollen with it. Susan had seated her in the kitchen with water and a cold cloth, had sent one of the younger hands who had returned from the fence work back to town with specific instructions about who to speak to at the stockyards and what to ask, and was sitting across from Nell with the composed and attentive manner of someone who is providing stability rather than requiring it. Wesley stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, watching Susan talk to Nell Prout in a voice that was quiet and certain and unhurried, and something in his chest did something that he could no longer attribute to coffee or anything else in his dietary habits. The hand came back from town with information. Tom Prout had gone north because his brother in Wichita had been hurt in an accident, and Tom had left in such a rush that he had not managed to get word to Nell. He had sent a message that morning, which arrived by telegram to the stockyards the same afternoon, and confirmed he was coming home the following day. Nell Prout cried again, this time with relief, and Susan helped her compose herself and arranged for one of the hands to drive her and her children back to town. After they left, Wesley found Susan in the kitchen, returning things to their places with the efficient movements of someone who had already processed the event and moved on. "You handled that well," he said. She glanced at him. "The poor woman walked 4 miles in the heat. The least I could do was sit with her. Most people would have told her to go to the sheriff. The sheriff would have told her it was too early to be concerned. I already knew it probably wasn't what she feared." He leaned against the doorframe, watching her. "How?" She paused, a cup in her hand. "Because she said he'd been worrying about his brother for 2 weeks. People generally don't abandon their families without something preceding it. There was a preceding thing, so the most likely explanation involved the preceding thing." She put the cup on the shelf. It was logical. Most people don't apply logic when there's a crying woman in their kitchen. Most people get so concerned with the emotion that they forget to think, she said. She turned and found him watching her, and something in his expression made her still for a moment. "What?" "Nothing," he said. And then, because it was not nothing and he was a man who had told her he valued honesty, "I was thinking that you are—" He stopped. "I am what?" she said. He looked at her. The afternoon light was coming through the kitchen window, and she had a streak of dust along one cheekbone from the morning's work that she had not noticed, and she was looking at him with those steady brown eyes that did not demand anything from him but somehow expected everything. "You are not at all what I expected," he said. She considered this. "Is that a complaint?" "No," he said, with a certainty that surprised him. "It isn't." She looked at him for another moment, and then she looked away, and he saw the line of her jaw change in a way that suggested the compliment had landed, and she was deciding what to do with it. "The fence will need 3 new posts," she said. "I know," he said. "I found a good price for post timber at the yard in town. I'll order them tomorrow." "Thank you," he said. There was a quality to the silence that followed that was different from other silences. The question of marriage had not been formally answered, and both of them knew it, and neither of them raised it directly, because the thing they were doing felt too carefully balanced to disturb. They were building something, though neither of them said so, and they were both experienced enough with difficult work to know that naming a thing too early could sometimes damage it. What changed the balance was the 4th of July. Caldwell held a celebration in the town square, with music and a good deal of the local population in their best clothes and children running between the adults' legs, and a speaker from the county seat, who said things about independence and liberty that everyone applauded. Wesley had not attended in 3 years, but Susan had indicated she would like to go, and Wesley had heard himself say he would take her before he had quite completed the decision to do so. They went in the wagon, Susan in a dark green dress that he had not seen before, and she had done something different with her hair that he spent approximately 4 minutes working out before arriving at the conclusion that she had put it up more carefully than usual, and that this was the difference. She looked, he thought, with an interior directness that was new to him, beautiful. The word arrived fully formed and without apology, and he let it stay. In Caldwell, they moved through the crowd together with the unconscious proximity of 2 people who have already, without discussing it, become accustomed to each other's company, and 3 separate people made jokes or comments about when the wedding was, and Wesley answered these with the careful noncommittal response of a man who intends to answer the question properly in private rather than publicly, and Susan managed them with the crisp, diplomatic deflection of someone who has handled worse. It was during the music, when someone had produced a fiddle and couples were dancing in the open square, that the evening shifted. A man named Davis Hawk, who ran a saloon on the main street and was known to have opinions about who he considered worth his attention, came and stood beside Susan, and made a remark about her that he intended as a compliment, but that managed to be nothing of the sort. The kind of remark that assumed a woman's primary interest was in being noticed by men who thought well of themselves. Susan looked at him with an expression of polite incomprehension, as though she had heard a sentence in a language she did not speak, and said, "I'm sorry, were you speaking to me?" in a tone that made Hawk blink, and then Wesley was at her side in a way that he had not quite consciously planned, and Hawk found something else to attend to quite quickly. Wesley and Susan stood together after that, and he was more aware than he had ever been of how close they were standing, and of the warmth of her arm near his, and of the fiddle playing something slow and deliberate in the summer night. "You didn't have to do that," she said, low enough that it was only for him. "I know," he said. "I was handling it. I know that too." A pause. The fiddle moved through something that had an ache in it. "Then why did you?" she said. He looked at her. In the lamplight of the summer square, she was looking back at him with those steady eyes, waiting for the honest answer, because that was what she always waited for. "Because I didn't want to watch someone speak to you that way," he said. And because he stopped. "Because," she said. "Because I didn't want him near you," he said simply. The quality of her eyes changed. Not dramatically, she was not a dramatic person, but there was a shift in them, something opening slightly, like a door moved just enough to indicate that it was not locked. "Wesley," she said. It was the first time she had used his given name without the formality of address, and they both registered it. "Yes," he said. "Do you want to dance?" He looked at her. I'm not sure I'm good at it. Neither am I, she said, but I'd like to try. They danced imperfectly in the July night in Caldwell, Kansas, and the fiddle played something that moved in the chest, and Susan's hand was in his and her other hand was at his shoulder, and they were close enough that he could smell the faint, clean scent of her hair, and he thought with complete clarity for the first time that he was in considerable trouble, and that it was the best kind. July moved into August, and August was hot and serious and busy with the demands of the ranch, and the thing between them continued to build in the spaces between work, in the evenings on the porch, in the way they now talked without the careful distance of people still evaluating each other, in the way they had developed, without planning it, a shared shorthand for the ranch's operations that only made sense to both of them. There was the morning she found him in the yard at dawn, staring at the horizon with the expression of a man who had not slept, and she had come out with 2 cups of coffee and handed him one without asking any preliminary questions, and stood beside him in the cool morning air, and after a while he had told her about his father and the ranch, and what it had cost to build it back up after a bad year early in his tenure, when the cattle market had dropped badly, and he had been 2 weeks from losing everything. He told her these things in a plain voice with the particular relief of someone who has kept a weight for a long time and has suddenly found someone willing to help carry it, not by taking it but by simply being present while it was named. She listened without interrupting, and when he finished she said, "You kept it," with a quiet certainty, as though the keeping was the thing that mattered. "Barely," he said. "Barely is still kept," she said. He looked at her in the morning light. "Susan." "Yes." "I want you to stay," he said. Not as he searched for the right words, not as a practical arrangement. "I want you to stay because again the words proved difficult, not because he lacked the feeling, but because he was a man who had not had much occasion to voice feelings of this particular kind, and the gap between what he felt and what he knew how to say was wide. She turned to face him, and her expression was careful but not closed, careful the way a person is careful with something they value. "I wasn't planning to leave," she said. "That's not what I'm asking." "I know what you're asking," she said. "I know you, Wesley Ramsey, perhaps better than you have been asked to be known for a long time." The honesty of this landed on him with a weight that was not unpleasant. "Then you know what I mean," he said. "I do," she said. "And I want to stay because of the same reason you want me to." She looked at him steadily. "Not because the accounts needed doing." "The accounts needed doing," he said, and she heard the shift in his voice, the humor underneath it. "The accounts needed doing," she agreed with the same humor. "But that is not why I'd stay." "Why would you stay?" She was quiet for a moment, looking at him in the early light of the Kansas morning, the prairie spread around them in every direction, the grass moving in the first breath of wind off the flat land. "Because somewhere in the last 3 months," she said, "I stopped thinking of this as a practical arrangement and started thinking of it as home. And you are—" She paused, and for the first time he saw something in her face that was not composure but was something richer, something open and a little uncertain, the expression of a woman who does not show vulnerability casually and is showing it now deliberately because she trusts where she is. "You are the reason it feels like home," she said. "Not the house. You." He set his coffee cup on the porch rail and took a step toward her, and she did not move back, and he put his hand against her face very carefully, the way a man does when he is aware that something matters enough to be careful with, and she looked up at him with those steady brown eyes that were not quite steady right now. "I am going to ask you to marry me," he said, "in a moment. I just want to say something first." "Say it," she said. "I put that advertisement in the newspaper because I wanted someone practical," he said. "Because I thought what I needed was someone who could manage what I couldn't manage alone. I thought if I could just get the practical parts right, then everything else would." He shook his head. "I thought love was something that got in the way of things. I'd seen it get in the way of things. I was trying to avoid it." "I know," she said softly. "I did not account for you," he said. "Specifically, I did not account for what it would be like to have you here. Not just your accounts and your roof patches and your survey maps, though God knows I needed all of those. I didn't account for what it would be like to—" He stopped. He tried again. I didn't account for the fact that I would wake up in the morning, and the first thing I would want would be to hear your voice." Her eyes, which had been careful, were no longer careful at all. "Wesley," she said. "Will you marry me?" he said. "Not because it's sensible, not because it's practical, because I love you, Susan, and I am fairly certain that I loved you before I had the sense to know it." She looked at him for a long moment, and he saw something move through her face that was the expression of a woman who has been strong for a long time and is now, for the first time in a long time, in a place where she does not have to be strong alone. "Yes," she said. "I'll marry you, because I love you too, and because," she paused, "because you are the first person in a very long time who looked at everything I am and found it not inconvenient." He did not have a response to this that was equal to it, so he kissed her instead, there on the porch in the August morning, with the Kansas light coming over the flat land and the coffee going cold on the rail. And it was, in the manner of first real kisses between people who have been circling toward each other for months, a thing of considerable feeling. They were married in Caldwell on the 15th of September, 1878, by the town's pastor, in a ceremony that Susan had organized with the efficiency she brought to everything, and that turned out, despite or perhaps because of this efficiency, to be genuinely beautiful. She wore a dress of ivory and cream that she had made herself in the evenings of August, and she walked to Wesley with the same direct stride that had crossed the stage stop in April, and she looked at him when she arrived beside him with an expression that was entirely unguarded, which was the most extraordinary thing he had ever been given. He said his vows in a steady voice and meant every syllable of them. She said hers with the same steadiness, and when she came to the word love, she looked at him with something in her eyes that made the pastor briefly lose his place in the text. Charlie Voss, seated in the second row, told the hand beside him quietly that it was about time. The fall came in with the sweep and color that the Kansas prairie produced in its October mood, broad blue skies, and the smell of dry grass, and the first cold moving in from the north. And they settled into married life with the ease of two people who have already, in effect, been living it for months, except that now there was a quality to the evenings that was new, a warmth that was not just the fire. A particular way he reached for her hand when they walked together that was not practical, but was not unnecessary. Susan had taken full charge of the ranch's accounts and discovered, by mid-October, that Wesley had been overpaying for his feed supply by approximately 12%, because the supplier in Wichita had been quietly adjusting the unit pricing, and Wesley had not caught it. She wrote the supplier a letter in terms that were polite, specific, and left no room for interpretation, and the unit pricing was corrected by return post, and Wesley calculated that the savings over a full year would amount to enough to buy the additional pasture land to the east that he had been wanting for 2 years. "How did you find that?" he asked. "I compared the unit price in the original contract to the current invoices," she said. "I had the contract in a box with the deed." "I know." "I read everything in the box," she said. "The first week." He shook his head, but he was smiling, the easy, genuine smile that had become more frequent since the summer. "You read everything in a box you had no reason to think was your business." "Everything on this ranch is my business," she said. "It's half mine." "It's half yours," he agreed. This had been a matter he had raised with the lawyer in Wichita, who had been surprised, and who had eventually drawn up documents that formalized Susan's equal partnership in the ranch, which was not a common arrangement in 1878, and which Wesley had insisted on with a quiet firmness that had ended the conversation. When she had seen the papers, Susan had looked at him for a long moment with an expression that was difficult to read. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "Half of it is your work and your thinking and your problem-solving. It would be dishonest not to." She looked at the papers in her hands and then at him, and he saw briefly something move through her face that was old and quiet, the particular look of someone who has been undervalued for long enough that being valued correctly comes as a kind of shock. "Thank you," she said, in a voice that was smaller than her usual voice. He took her hand. "Half," he said. always. November brought the issue of the East Pasture, which Wesley wanted to acquire, and which turned out to involve a negotiation with the widow of the man who had owned it. A woman named Frances Durant, who was 62 and sharp, and had no particular interest in selling to anyone who had not first proved they were worth selling to. Susan went with Wesley to call on Frances Durant, and they sat in her parlor, and Frances looked them both over with the appraisal of someone who has lived long enough to see through performance. Frances ended up talking to Susan for most of the visit, the way two people will sometimes find each other across a room and simply begin the real conversation. And she told Susan about the East Pasture and its water source and its history, and Susan told Frances about the ranch and their plans for it. And by the end of the afternoon, Frances had agreed to sell at a fair price with a handshake, which in Sumner County in 1878 was as binding as anything on paper. On the ride home, Wesley said, "How did you do that?" "I listened to her," Susan said. "She didn't want to sell the land because she didn't want her husband's work to be wasted by someone who didn't care about it. I told her about your father and the ranch and what you did to keep it. She's not selling it to us as a business transaction. She's entrusting it." He looked at her across the wagon seat. "That's a very different thing. Most important things are very different from how they first appear," she said. He covered her hand with his. She turned her hand and threaded her fingers through his, which was something she had taken to doing in small, unannounced ways that he had noticed the first time she did it and never stopped noticing. The winter was hard in the way that Kansas winters were periodically hard, not brutal, but serious, with several weeks of cold that required the ranch to operate in the compressed, deliberate way of an organization that knows the margin is narrow. Susan managed the household and the accounts with the practical efficiency that had characterized everything she did, and also found time in the evenings to do things he had not expected. She read to him, occasionally in the evenings. She had brought a good number of books from Independence in the trunk he had carried from the stage, and she had a reading voice that was clear and expressive in a way that surprised him the first time he heard it, because he had associated her with practical things, and the way she read was entirely impractical, which is to say beautiful. She was absorbed by what she read, and she wanted him to be absorbed by it too, and he generally was, partly because of the books and partly because of the voice, and partly because of the fire and the nearness of her on the settee. She made things practical things mostly, sewing and mending and the construction of useful objects, but occasionally something that was just interesting, like the carved wooden puzzle she made for herself one January evening from a scrap of pine, which she then solved in under 3 minutes and put aside with the expression of someone who has answered a question and moved on. He watched her do this and said, "Did you just make a puzzle so you could solve it?" "I like making things," she said. "And then figuring out how they work. Including people," he said. She looked at him with a glint of something warm. "You took me 4 months," she said. "What did you determine?" He said with honest curiosity. She considered the question with the same seriousness she gave everything. "That you are fundamentally a good man who was afraid that needing people was a weakness," she said. "That you had decided love was a complication that caused losses. That you have a better sense of humor than you generally permit yourself to show. And that once you are certain of someone, there is no one more certain." She paused. "Was I accurate?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Completely," he said. She nodded as if confirming a calculation. "I know," she said. He pulled her close, and she came without resistance, settling against his side with the ease of someone who has come to know exactly where she fits. And outside the Kansas winter moved over the prairie in the dark, and the fire made the room warm, and he thought with the full clear thought of a man who has stopped resisting his own happiness, that he was the most fortunate person he knew. Spring came to the ranch with the reliable drama of the plains, sudden, explosive, green pushing up through the brown, with the urgency of something long held back. The cattle were in good condition after the winter. The East Pasture acquisition had been completed with Francis Durrant's signature in January, and the ranch was expanding in the measured, well-planned way that Susan's management had made possible. In March, Susan told him she was expecting their first child. She told him at breakfast, with the practical directness she brought to everything, a fact to be communicated, plans to be made, but he saw in her face, underneath the composure, something that was not practical at all, something that was tender and uncertain and hopeful. And he got up from the table and came around to her and held her face in his hands and looked at her until she looked back fully, and the composure went soft. "Are you happy?" She asked, not because she doubted him, but because she wanted to hear it. "I am beyond what I have words for," he said. "Are you?" "Yes," she said. "I am not." She paused. "I didn't think I would want this so much. I thought I would be calm about it." "You are calm about it," he said. "Inside I am not particularly calm," she said, with the faint smile that he had learned was the warmest version of her smile, reserved for moments that were entirely real. He kissed her forehead and then stayed close, his forehead against hers, and they were both quiet for a moment with the size of it. "We'll need to add a room," she said eventually. "I know," he said, laughing against her hair. "I've already sketched where it should go," she said. "Of course you have," he said. The room was built through the spring and early summer, Wesley and Charlie Voss doing most of the framing while Susan consulted on the design with the proprietary authority of someone whose investment in the outcome was directly personal. She had opinions about the window placement and the ceiling height and the door swing, all of which she expressed and justified, and two of which overruled Wesley's initial plan in ways that were, he had to admit, clearly improvements. In the summer of 1879, two other things happened that were worth the telling. The first was that a family came through Caldwell in July, the Harmon family, a father and mother and 5 children, heading west with everything they owned on 2 wagons, looking for land. They stopped in town for supplies, and Susan encountered Mrs. Harmon at the general store, and could see in the woman's face that she was exhausted in the particular way of a person who has been traveling a long time and absorbing the weight of other people's uncertainty. Susan invited them to the ranch for a meal and to rest their horses, and the Harmons came and ate at the Ramsey table, and the children ran in the yard, and Wesley talked to the father, a serious man from Ohio named George Harmon, about the land further south, and the conditions, and what he knew of the settlements in Indian Territory that were not yet opened, but which everyone in Sumner County was hearing things about. It was an evening of noise and life that Wesley had not known the house could produce, and he watched Susan move through it with the particular ease of someone who has decided to open her home and means it fully, making certain the children had enough to eat and the parents had a moment's peace. And he thought, not for the first time, that she was the kind of person around whom a community naturally organized itself, because she was reliable and present and completely without pretense. The Harmons stayed 2 nights and moved on south. Susan kept a letter from Mrs. Harmon for years afterward. The second thing that happened in the summer of 1879 was that Wesley discovered he had been defrauded. It was not dramatic the way it would be in a story where the villain was obvious. It was quiet and careful, and it had been going on for 2 years before Susan found it in the ledgers, buried in the records of the cattle sales at the Caldwell stockyards. A man named Albert Sims, who served as the weighmaster at the stockyards, had been systematically recording the weights of Ramsey cattle at less than their actual weight, which meant that Wesley had been paid less than market value for every sale that went through Sims' station. Over 2 years, the discrepancy was not minor. Susan brought the ledgers to Wesley in the evening with the pages marked and the numbers laid out clearly, and explained what she had found, and how she had cross-referenced it against the weights recorded at 2 other stations for the same animals when they had been driven through on their way to market. Wesley sat with the ledgers for a long time. "How long has this been going on?" he said. "At least since the records I have," she said, "which means at least 2 years, probably more." He was quiet with the particular stillness of a man managing a significant anger. "Sims," he said. "Before you do anything," she said, and her voice was the calm voice she used when she was being the counterweight to someone else's urgency. "I want you to know that I have prepared a full written accounting of the discrepancies with dates and amounts, and I believe the county sheriff has both the authority and the motivation to address this properly, which would result in both restitution and appropriate legal consequence, rather than a confrontation that might result in neither." He looked at her. "You prepared a written accounting before I told you, because I knew you would want a ride to the stockyards tonight. I do want a ride to the stockyards tonight." "I know," she said. "But the written accounting is better." He took a breath. He looked at the ledgers and then at her. She was sitting across the table with the patience of someone who has made the right argument and is giving him time to arrive at it himself. "You always think 3 steps ahead," he said. "I think it's more useful than not," she said. "It is," he said. "It's aggravating and it is absolutely useful." "Thank you," she said. "That is exactly the combination I was aiming for." He went to the sheriff's office the following morning with Susan's written accounting, and the sheriff, a practical man named Burr who had dealt with Susan Bishop Ramsey before and had a deep respect for her documentation, took the matter seriously. The investigation took 3 weeks, during which several other ranchers were found to have been defrauded by the same method, and Albert Sims was arrested and brought to trial in Wichita, and the restitution that was ordered covered most of what had been taken from Wesley and the other affected ranchers. It was not a complete recovery, but it was a just outcome, and Susan noted quietly that it had been achieved without Wesley Ramsey riding to the stockyards in a rage and possibly doing something that would have made the legal situation considerably more complicated. "Next time," he said, with the dry humor that had become natural between them. "There won't be a next time," she said. "I check the weights myself now." He looked at her. "Of course you do. Someone has to." Their son was born in October of 1879, a boy they named Thomas, after Susan's father who had died when she was 16, with the middle name David after Wesley's father. He arrived in the world with his mother's eyes and his father's jaw, and an immediate quality of purpose that made the midwife say, privately, that baby knew what he was about. Wesley held Thomas in his hands the hour of his birth, and felt something break open in his chest that he had not known was there to break a love of the simple, uncomplicated, furious kind that arrives with children and is unlike everything else. He looked at Susan, who was tired in a way that went all the way through her, and was still looking at their son with the expression of someone who has arrived somewhere after a very long road. "Hello, Thomas," Susan said to the baby, in the quiet voice she used for things that were entirely real. The baby made a sound. Wesley thought with complete seriousness that he had no adequate response to this moment, and that was perfectly acceptable. That first year with Thomas was full of the particular exhaustion and joy of new parenthood, which Susan navigated with her characteristic approach, methodical about the practical elements, completely unhurried about the emotional ones. She was a good mother in the way she was good at everything, not through some natural beatific ease, but through attention and commitment, and the willingness to learn what she did not know. She also continued to manage the ranch accounts, which she did at the kitchen table in the evenings while Thomas slept, with a small lamp and the same concentration that had characterized her work from the beginning. Wesley, for his part, found that fatherhood had done something unexpected to him. It had made him more present, more attentive, as though the arrival of Thomas had clarified something about what mattered and given him permission to feel it fully. He spent more time in the house than he had before Thomas, not because the ranch demanded less of him, but because the house demanded more of him, and this was not a sacrifice. They had a disagreement that year about a thing that was not small. It began with the matter of a neighboring ranch family named Ortega. The Ortega family had been on their land south of the Ramsey, spread for 3 generations. Their grandfather, having come north from Texas, with a Spanish land grant that predated the American settlement of the area, and they were being pressured by a group of newer settlers who disputed the land grant's validity and had been using various forms of social and economic coercion to make the Ortega's situation difficult. The dispute had a quality of injustice about it that was not subtle, and Susan had become aware of it through Francis Durant, who had known the Ortega family for years. Susan wanted Wesley to use their standing in the community to support the Ortegas publicly, to be a clear voice in their favor, because the Ramseys were well regarded and their support would have weight. Wesley agreed that the situation was unjust, but was hesitant about the degree of public involvement, not from cowardice, but from a practical concern about the impact on their own business relationships with some of the men who were on the other side of the dispute. They argued about this at the kitchen table with the full force of two people who respect each other enough to argue honestly. They have a legal right to their land, Susan said, a right that is older than most of the people trying to take it from them. I know that, Wesley said, but if we go publicly against Caldwell and his associates, we lose the Caldwell contract, and that is a third of our cattle sales. So we let an injustice stand because we'd lose a contract, she said, with a flatness in her voice that was the closest she came to contempt. That is not what I said, he said. It's what the position amounts to. You're simplifying it. I am not simplifying it, she said. I am looking directly at it. A family is being pushed off land they have held for 3 generations because people want it and they have the power to take it. And we have the standing to say clearly that it is wrong, and you are weighing that against a business contract. He was quiet. She waited, and her waiting was not passive. It had a pressure in it, the pressure of someone who has said the true thing and is giving it time to work. If we lose the Caldwell contract, he said slowly, I've been going over the numbers, and I have already gone over the numbers, she said. If we lose the Caldwell contract, we can manage with the eastern pasture and the increased production from the spring herd. It will be tighter for a year. We can manage tight. He looked at her. You'd already run the numbers. Before I raised the subject, she said, because I wanted to know what we were actually deciding. He was quiet for a long moment, looking at his hands on the table. You have never once asked me to take a comfortable path when it was the wrong one, he said. No, she said. All right, he said, we'll support the Ortegas. They did. Wesley went to the county commissioner's office and filed a formal statement of support for the Ortega land grant's validity, and Susan drafted a letter that was signed by Wesley and by Francis Durant and by 2 other ranchers she had carefully persuaded, and the letter was delivered to the relevant legal body in Wichita, along with documentation that Susan had obtained about the history of the land grant. The Caldwell contract was lost, exactly as Wesley had anticipated. They managed tight for a year, exactly as Susan had calculated. And at the end of that year, the legal body in Wichita upheld the Ortega land grant, and the Ortega family stayed on their land. Alina Ortega, who was 48 and had the bearing of someone who has fought for everything she had, came to the Ramsey ranch personally to thank them. She brought food and wine and sat at Susan's kitchen table for an afternoon, and they talked about the land and the fight and what it meant. And when Alina left, she held Susan's hands for a moment at the door and said, "You understood why it mattered." "Of course," Susan said. "Not everyone does," Alina said. "More people should," Susan said. Wesley, who had been standing in the background of this exchange with Thomas on his hip, watched his wife say goodbye to Alina Ortega and felt a kind of pride that was entirely different from the pride he took in the cattle operation or the pasture or the account books. A pride in her, in what she was, in the specific particular person he had found when he had gone looking for someone practical. He had found someone practical. He had found so much more. The year of 1881 arrived with additional snow and the arrival in Caldwell of the new rail extension, which changed the cattle market considerably. It was now faster and more efficient to move cattle to the stockyards in Wichita and Kansas City, and the economics of ranching in Sumner County shifted accordingly. Wesley had to make decisions about the operation that were significant, and he made them in conversation with Susan, at the kitchen table, with maps and ledgers and the back and forth of two people who are thinking through something hard together, and are equal to the thinking. The rail connection also brought, in the spring of 1881, the arrival of a man Wesley had not seen in 7 years, his brother Nathan, who was 2 years younger and had gone west to New Mexico Territory in 1874 and not been heard from in any consistent way since. Nathan Ramsey arrived unannounced on a Tuesday in April, thinner than Wesley remembered him, with a beard and the eyes of a man who has lived roughly, and he stood at the front gate of the ranch he had grown up on with the particular expression of someone who is not sure of his welcome. Wesley was in the yard when Nathan arrived. There was a moment when the two brothers looked at each other across the space of the years, and then Wesley walked to the gate and opened it, and that was the whole of it. Susan met Nathan at the door and assessed him with the rapid, thorough assessment she gave new people, and she fed him and gave him coffee and asked him about New Mexico Territory in a way that was genuinely curious, and allowed him to talk without having to explain or account for the years. And by the end of the evening, Nathan was sitting at the Ramsey table with Thomas in his lap, looking at his brother across the room with an expression that was the expression of a man who has come home to something better than he left. Nathan stayed 3 weeks. He and Wesley rebuilt a section of the south fence that had been needing attention, and they talked in the way brothers talk when they are doing physical work together, indirectly, obliquely, covering distance through labor. Wesley asked him nothing he didn't want to say. Susan asked him nothing that was inappropriate and everything that he found he actually wanted to answer, because she asked with the genuine interest of someone who is not managing a conversation but is actually curious. And Nathan Ramsey, who had not been genuinely curious about in a long time, found this restorative. Before he left, he told Wesley that Susan was the best thing that had ever walked through the door of the Ramsey house, which was high praise from Nathan, who had never been inclined toward sentimentality. Wesley told Nathan he knew. Nathan rode south again in May with the address of the ranch in his pocket and a standing invitation to come back, which he would act on the following Christmas and each Christmas afterward for the rest of their lives. In the summer of 1881, Susan told Wesley she was expecting their second child. She told him the same way she had told him about Thomas plainly at breakfast with the composure that was her natural medium, and he did the same thing he had done then. He got up from the table and came around to her and held her face in his hands. "How are you feeling?" he said. "Well," she said, "a little tired in the mornings." Thomas was the same, he said. Thomas was entirely different, she said. "I feel different with this one." He looked at her. "Different how?" "I don't know yet," she said. "Just different." A pause. "I think it might be a girl." "A hunch," he said, with the fond slight smile he had for the moments when she moved outside pure reason. "Women know," she said, with a dignity that didn't quite suppress the warmth in it. She was right. Their daughter was born in January of 1882, in the cold, bright deep of a Kansas winter, and they named her Clara, a name Susan had been carrying quietly for years, the name of a great-aunt she had never met but had always liked the sound of, and Wesley had said yes immediately because he had learned to trust her judgment in virtually everything, including names. Clara arrived with her mother's dark hair and both of her parents' serious eyes, and from her earliest weeks she watched the world with an attention that made the midwife say she had never seen a baby look so thoroughly at everything. "She's taking an inventory," Susan said, watching her daughter in the early weeks. "She comes by it naturally," Wesley said. The ranch in the early 1880s was a well-run, expanding operation, and it was known in Sumner County as a Ramsey operation in the fullest sense. Not Wesley Ramsey's ranch with a capable wife attached, but something that was genuinely joint, the product of both of them. And the people of Caldwell who had known Wesley since before Susan arrived had watched this happen, and most of them had arrived at the conclusion that the advertisement Wesley had put in the newspaper in 1878 had been one of the better investments in the history of Sumner County. Frances Durrant, who was still sharp and still in her house at 65, said this to Susan directly on one of Susan's regular visits, which had become something Frances genuinely looked forward to. "He was an unhappy man before you," Frances said. "Not miserable, just closed, like a door nobody had tried. He just needed someone willing to knock," Susan said. "You did more than knock," Frances said. "You built a better door." Susan laughed, the real full laugh that she gave to Frances and to Wesley and to her children and to few other people. "He did most of the work," she said. "He did," Frances agreed. "But you showed him where to start." There were small things and large things, and all of them accumulated into the life of the ranch over those years. The way Thomas grew from a baby into a serious, curious boy who followed his mother around the yard, with a focus that was entirely familiar to anyone who had observed Susan Bishop Ramsey at close range. The way Clara grew into a child who was different from Thomas in almost every detectable way, louder and more spontaneous and quicker to laugh, but who had the same underlying quality of paying close attention to everything that mattered. The way Charlie Voss retired in 1883, and Wesley hired a young man from Texas named Marcus who turned out to be good with horses in a way that was approaching remarkable, and who Susan persuaded to also handle some of the bookkeeping because she had observed him calculating freight rates in his head while ostensibly doing other things, and had concluded he was wasted on saddle work alone. Marcus, who had grown up being told he was useful for one thing, and should keep to that one thing, was surprised enough by this that he stood in the kitchen doorway looking at Susan for a long moment before he managed to say yes. "Don't look so startled," Susan told him. "Being good at more than one thing is not unusual. No one ever," he started. "Well, now someone has," she said. "The ledgers for March need reconciling. I'll show you the system." Marcus turned out to be excellent at the accounts, and he worked the Ramsey Ranch for 11 years, which was longer than most working relationships in that part of Kansas. In 1884, Wesley and Susan rode together to Wichita for a 2-day trip that combined ranch business with the first genuine time they had been alone together, without children or hands or the constant logistics of the operation, since before Thomas was born. They stayed at a hotel that was the best available in Wichita in 1884, which was not luxurious but was clean and quiet, and had a dining room with real tablecloths. They had dinner in the dining room on the first evening, and they talked with the ease of two people who have been talking for 6 years and have not run out of things to say, and Wesley looked at her across the table in the candlelight and felt something very quiet and very large, the feeling of a man who is sitting with his life and recognizes that it is good. "What are you thinking?" she said. He had learned in 6 years to answer this question honestly rather than deflecting it. "I'm thinking that I owe you an apology," he said. She looked at him. "For what?" "For the advertisement," he said. "For the way I thought about it, like I was placing a supply order." She was quiet for a moment. "You've apologized for that before. I know, I keep thinking of new ways it was wrong." "Wesley," she said with the gentle firmness that was one of her most characteristic qualities, "the advertisement was exactly what it was. It brought you what you needed, which turned out to be considerably more than you asked for. I'd leave it alone." "You're not bothered by it," he said. She considered. "I was, a little, in the beginning. The way it was written made me feel like I was being evaluated for a position, which I suppose I was." She tilted her head. "But then I thought about what I'd written in return. I wasn't exactly writing poetry. I was also describing a transaction." "You wrote that you expected honesty without exception," he said. "I did," she said. "That line is what made me answer your letter," he said. She looked at him. "Truly. All the other letters were, I don't know, they felt like they were performing something. You weren't performing anything." "I didn't know how," she said with a wryness. "I've never been good at performing what I don't feel." "I know," he said. "That is one of my favorite things about you." She looked at him across the table. and the candlelight was warm on her face, and she had the same steady eyes and the same quality of full attention that she had had the day she walked across the stage stop in Caldwell in April of 1878 with her leather tool case and her dusty hem and her unperformed, undecorated, entirely honest self. "What else?" she said, with the faint warmth of someone who knows they are loved and is not above enjoying hearing it said. He took her hand across the table. "Everything else," he said. "Everything you are and everything you've done and every evening and every disagreement and every problem you solved that I didn't know was solvable. Everything." She looked at him for a moment with eyes that were not quite steady, which happened rarely enough that it always moved him when it did. "Everything," she repeated softly. "Everything," he confirmed. They were quiet for a moment in the candle-lit dining room in Wichita, and the world outside went on in its way, and they sat in the still center of their life together with complete satisfaction. In 1885, they built a proper study for Susan, a room that had been a storeroom, and which Wesley and Marcus converted over the winter into a room with proper shelving for her books and her ledgers and her correspondence, with a good north-facing window for clear light, and a desk that Wesley had made himself over several weeks in the barn, working in the evenings when Susan thought he was doing other things. The desk was not ornamental. It was solid and exactly the right height, and had a drawer on the left for the current ledgers and a drawer on the right for correspondence, and a top that was wide enough for maps laid flat. When he showed her the room, she stood in the doorway and took it in, and he watched her face go through something that she was not fully managing to contain, which was unusual enough to tell him everything. "You built the desk," she said. "It took a while to get the height right," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she walked into the room and ran her hands along the surface of the desk and said nothing for a bit. "This is," she started. "A practical room," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." And then she turned and came to him and put her arms around him in the full, unguarded way she had when the composure was entirely gone, and she said against his shoulder, "It is absolutely perfect." He held her and thought that this was the truest measure of everything, that she, who valued the practical, was moved most deeply by the practical thing done with care. The desk made from attention, the study made from knowing her. Thomas, at 6 years old, came looking for his parents and found them in the doorway of the new study, his mother's arms around his father's neck, and said, "What are you doing?" With the thorough bewilderment of a 6-year-old, and both his parents laughed, and Susan scooped him up, and the three of them stood in the doorway of the new room in the late afternoon light. Clara was 3 and asleep in the house, and the ranch was running well, and the east pasture was producing, and the accounts were in order, and outside the Kansas light lay long and gold over the flat land. In the autumn of 1886, when Thomas was 7 and Clara was 4, Susan discovered she was expecting again. She was 34, which was not young for another child but was not alarming, and she told Wesley at breakfast, and he held her face in his hands the same way he had done twice before, which was a ritual that had never diminished. "3," he said. "3," she confirmed. "Are you well?" "I am well," she said. "I am also quite certain this will be a boy." He looked at her. "Another hunch, a strong one," she said. She was right again, as she generally was. Their second son arrived in the spring of 1887, and they named him David, which had been Wesley's father's name and the middle name of their firstborn Thomas, and which Susan had proposed because she had noticed that Wesley spoke of his father with a particular quiet respect, and she thought the name deserved more than a middle placement. David arrived in the world with a set of lungs that immediately distinguished him from both his siblings, who had both been relatively quiet infants, and Clara, who was 5 by then and entirely interested in the new baby in a way that involved a great deal of scrutiny, declared him to be acceptable after her first thorough inspection. Thomas regarded his new brother with the philosophical equanimity of a 7-year-old who has already managed the experience of a younger sibling once and knows the general shape of it. "Will he always be loud?" Thomas asked. "He'll quiet down," Susan told him. "When?" "Give it a few months," she said. Thomas considered this timeline and appeared to file it. The late 1880s settled into years that were full and real and built of the accumulated ordinary extraordinary of a life well made. The ranch expanded again, moderately and carefully, always within what the numbers supported, which was the way Susan operated and which Wesley had come to understand was not caution for its own sake, but intelligence about limits. They hired additional hands as the operation grew. Marcus continued to manage the accounts alongside the horsework, and had, in fact, become so indispensable in both roles that by 1888 his salary had been increased 3 times, and he had quietly put down roots in Caldwell, a small house on the east side of town, a life. Frances Durrant died in the winter of 1889, quietly and in her own bed at 73. Susan was with her in the final days, having received word from Frances's niece that Frances was failing, and she sat with the old woman in the way that was her particular gift, without performance, without excessive emotion, with the steady present attention that Frances had always valued in her. Frances told Susan in the last clear conversation they had that she had watched Susan run that ranch and raise those children and love that man, and she wanted Susan to know that she had done it properly, which from Frances Durrant was the highest possible assessment. "I had good material to work with," Susan said. "The ranch and the man both. You shaped them both," Frances said. "Don't be modest, you built something." Susan held Frances's hand and said, "I had help." "The best ones always know how to use help," Frances said, and closed her eyes. They buried Frances Durrant in the Caldwell Cemetery in February of 1889. And Susan stood at the grave in the cold and thought about what Frances had said, "You built something," and looked across the grave to where Wesley was standing with Thomas on one side and Clara on the other, David on his hip, looking back at her with the expression she had learned was his version of "I am here, completely, in whatever way you need," which was the expression she had not known she was looking for. All those years ago, until she had found it. In the years that followed, the children grew with the particular energy of children who have been given both roots and room. Thomas became a young man who had his mother's methodical mind and his father's physical capability, and who developed a genuine passion for the cattle operation that both his parents found deeply satisfying to observe. Clara was her own construction, impossible to characterize simply, with an intelligence and a warmth and a wit that she deployed in her own particular way, and that made the people around her feel more alive. David was loud until he was approximately 4, and then became a quiet, thoughtful child who built things from whatever materials were available, which Susan recognized without comment as something she had also done. In 1892, Wesley and Susan stood together on the south porch of the ranch house in the September evening, watching the Kansas light change on the flat land, Thomas working a horse in the far paddock, Clara reading on the steps below them, David somewhere in the barn constructing something that made rhythmic tapping sounds. Nathan was due to visit for Christmas, and had written to say he was bringing someone, a woman from Santa Fe, which had generated its own conversation at the Ramsey table. Wesley's hand was over Susan's hand on the porch rail, which was where his hand frequently ended up when they were standing together, and she was leaning slightly against his side, which was where she frequently ended up. 14 years, he said. She looked at him. Since the advertisement. Since the stage stop, he said. Since you walked across the street with your tool case. You remember the tool case? I remember everything about that afternoon, he said. I remember exactly what you were wearing and exactly what you said, and exactly what you looked like. She looked at him with the warm expression that still had, at 40, the same quality as it had at 26, the expression of someone who is not performing feeling but is simply in possession of it. What did I look like? She said, in the tone she used when she wanted to hear something said. He turned to look at her full on, the way he still did after 14 years, still with the attention she had never stopped warranting. The gray in her hair was beginning at the temples, and it suited her. The steadiness in her eyes was the same, The line of her, the way she stood, the same. You looked like someone who had already decided you were equal to whatever was coming, he said. You looked like someone who was not afraid, and I thought. He paused. What did you think? She said. I thought, who is this woman? He said, and I was right to think it. She looked at him, and everything was in her face uncovered the way it only was with him. You wrote that advertisement wanting someone sensible, she said. I know, he said, and you got someone sensible. I got considerably more than I asked for, he said. I know, she said, with the warm simplicity of someone who is not being immodest but is simply being accurate. I know what I am. I wasn't sure you would. I figured it out, he said. It took you a few months, she said. The best things take time to understand properly, he said. She looked at him for a moment, and then she turned back to the porch view, the flat land and the September light and the ranch that was theirs, fully and equally, the good accumulated weight of everything they had built. Do you know what I thought when I first read your advertisement? She said. No, he said, honestly curious. I thought, here is a man who is afraid to ask for what he actually needs, she said. He's described the practical requirements of a household and called it a marriage proposal. I thought he either needs someone to show him what he's missing, or he's already lost and doesn't know it. Which was it? Wesley said. She looked at him, and the faint smile was there, the real one. You just needed someone to show you, she said. He pulled her close, and she came the way she always came, without performance, without hesitation, with the full ease of a woman who knows exactly where she belongs and chose it deliberately, and has never once been wrong about the choice. Susan, he said. Wesley, she said. In the paddock, Thomas brought the horse through a clean turn and looked up at the porch with the expression of a young man who sees his parents and knows, without needing to analyze it, that what he is looking at is what love looks like when it is real. Not the decorative kind, not the convenient kind, but the kind that was built by two honest people out of hard work and good faith and the willingness to be known fully, and to keep choosing each other in full knowledge of what that knowing contained. Clara looked up from her book and then back down, with the half-smile of someone who has seen this scene before and finds it reliably good. In the barn, David's tapping continued, constructing something. The prairie lay wide and gold in the September light of 1892, and the Ramsey Ranch rested in the middle of it with the solid, generous permanence of something that has been built right, built to last not through rigidity, but through the kind of strength that has room in it. Room for children and arguments and hard winters and honest words spoken across a kitchen table in the lamplight. Wesley Ramsey had asked for a sensible and practical woman. She was both. He had not accounted for what else she would be. He was glad, every day of the life they had made, that he had not. Because what she was, beyond the sensibility, beyond the practicality, at the heart of everything Susan Bishop Ramsey was exactly what he had needed without knowing how to ask for it. And she had known. She had always known. And she had come anyway, with her leather tool case and her steady eyes and her unwillingness to be anything other than entirely herself. And she had made herself at home in his life and his house, and his heart with the same quiet, capable certainty she brought to everything. And he had loved her for it every day since, and he would love her for every day that followed, on the wide flat land of the Kansas prairie, in the home they had made together out of honesty and work, and everything that is better than sense.